Dr. Tabor, what is your evidence for the first disciples not proclaiming the resurrection immediately after Jesus' death?
Well, I think this is Sages and Pages. Thanks for the question. Well, they did proclaim it. Mark doesn't have them proclaim it, but they do say you will see him. And certainly Mark knows that the gospel went forth. First verse says the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so they did proclaim him, but not, according to the Gospel of Peter, not for a week or so. You've got the days of unleavened bread, that's 8 days, 7 days plus Passover, 8 days. And the Gospel of Peter says, kind of goes with Mark, they found the tomb empty, then they wept and cried for 7 days. And then Peter said, I'm going fishing. And they went up to the Galilee, and then they had their visionary experiences. And then they did, I think, proclaim the resurrection. There I would go with Paul's earliest testimony, 1 Corinthians 15, that he apparently received from Peter, from James, from others, that they had appearances. But I think the early tradition is these were in Galilee, not in Jerusalem. After all, would Mark say, you will see him in Galilee, and also you'll see him later today? It just doesn't make sense. It's two different traditions. It has to do with the Galilee tradition of the movement and the Jerusalem Judean tradition of the movement.
That's something we didn't even get into about how the Gospels do different. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. How do you harmonize that?
I think Crossan talked about some of that yesterday. And the other thing, Luke is the one who has the most Jerusalem appearances. But guess what he says? This is kind of a problem. Jesus tells them not to leave Jerusalem until Shavuot or Pentecost. Well, that's 50 days later. And he says, don't leave the city. Well, how are they going to see him in the Galilee if they don't leave the city? So he doesn't even have any Galilee appearances. John comes along and says, whoops. Yeah, they had stuff in Jerusalem, but then they did leave the city. And when they were up fishing, they saw him in the Galilee. And so he puts on chapter 21, and he realizes there's some problem here. We better put them both together. But I think resurrection is a misnomer. Here I really agree with. When Paul talks about resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, it's raised to be transformed into this glorious state. And anybody that's followed my stuff knows I talk about it constantly, and I won't go into any detail here. It's all over my YouTube, my interviews with Derek. So I think the awakening of faith was in the Galilee, and certainly Peter seems to have seen him first, and James, and the 12, and the 500 brethren, and all the apostles, and so forth. They begin to have these experiences of seeing Jesus, and finally Paul. And Paul equates and compares his experience. Have I not seen the Lord? 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 15. And so that would be how I would explain it.
Thank you so much. Gnostic informant Neil, if you haven't subscribed to his channel, you're probably going to cook in an eternal conscious torment, but I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and give you the opportunity before we end up cooking you.
Is that like purgatory? They get purgatory, or did they can...
It's something like that.
If they do it today, no purgatory either.
Exactly. Neil, thank you for the super chat. Gnostic informant says, we oftentimes hear that each gospel is directed at a specific group of people. Is this true? If so, who are the groups of people that the four gospels are directed at?
Endless discussions among scholars, as you would expect, and endless disagreement, as you would expect. But essentially, it would be not so much name groups, but stages of the development of the Jesus movement. I think chronology really helps here. I believe Mark's story that we just summarized and talked about does represent a kind of Pauline anti gospel. And by anti gospel, I mean any of those that are thinking following Jesus is glory, hallelujah, in power and taking over all kinds of positions of rulership, which Jesus warned against. And in Mark, he's concerned that that's what they're really interested in. Paul talks about that as well when he talks about his sufferings. Remember, I wrote the book Paul's Ascent to Paradise, which has to do with his ascent to the third heaven and into paradise. But then he talks about his sufferings. Romans 8 will be glorified if we suffer. So I think Mark is concerned that people are putting the glory before the suffering. Matthew is from a different period. Jerusalem is long ago destroyed. There's still some apocalyptic expectation. But when he gives the apocalypse in Matthew 24, he adds 3 stories of delay. Take a look. They're not in Mark. 3 stories of delay right in a row. Bang, bang, bang. That cannot be chance. It's like, yeah, it's soon, but it's going to be longer than we thought. A man goes into another country, and after a long time, he comes back, you see. And the wicked servant says, the master's delayed, and he begins to misbehave. So Matthew is concerned, and also putting together Jesus in a more organized way. Remember, he arranges the sayings of Jesus into 5 blocks of material. Some people think it's even to mirror like a new Torah or something like that. Luke, people think Luke is very Pauline. If you ask any scholar that's worked on Luke, Luke is hardly Pauline at all, although by that I mean Paul's message in his 7 letters. He's very pro Paul as a remembered hero who goes to the Gentiles. But as far as name groups, Neil, I wouldn't, even figuring it out geographically, like one is Galilee and one is Jerusalem and one is Antioch and one is Alexandria and so forth. I mean, there could be indications of that here and there, but we're just in the dark on how all of those things circulate. But they're all influenced heavily by Paul. You can see that with the Last Supper. Paul's the one who says, I received from the Lord on the night he was betrayed. Mark repeats that. He took bread, he took wine. And we have other Christian sources that don't know anything about that, like the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles. And it survives now in Greek, in a Greek manuscript or two. And it has a totally different Eucharist. It calls it the Eucharist, but it's more like a Jewish blessing of bread and wine, looking forward to the kingdom. It actually reminds you of what you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they're all Pauline. The Jamesian branch, or I call him James, he's really Yaakov or Jacob. That branch of the followers of Jesus, they're pretty much over by 70 when the temple's destroyed. James is dead. They're scattered. We think they go to Transjordan. Some of them come back. But I think that day is pretty well past. They don't cease to exist. We know them as the Ebionites, but none of our gospels are Ebionite. We have the Gospel of the Hebrews and Gospel of the Ebionites in fragment to pick up on that. So we've got these, what Helmut Kirster called years ago, trajectories of early Christianity. They're trajectories going through time. And there's a kind of Gnosticizing trajectory, that would be the Gospel of John. There's a Mark suffering trajectory, probably up until the destruction of the temple. But really, frankly, we have experts on each one of these. Look at the Anchor Bible volumes, look at the Hermania commentaries. Often there's not real agreement. For Mark, I would go to Joel Marcus or somebody like that. Probably has the best work on Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of Robin Faith Walsh's recent work on the origins of Christian literature and pointing out
Yeah.
how getting away from like German romanticism and whatnot on these gospels, she thinks well-educated people would have documented these. That doesn't mean they weren't learning oral tradition or finding about the stories, but it was like Romans or in the Roman Empire, people were curious about this guy that they hear rumors of, like Jesus, and they're hearing stories from followers and people who passed down these different narratives, and they created a story of their own.
Yeah.
She's not against that idea, but she's like, a lot of this stuff is speculative and then using romanticism. But thank you,
Oh, let
Neil.
me ask you. Let me ask you this: do you think they liked each other? Everybody assumes because it's in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Oh, great! They put them all together. I would guess that Matthew, when you look at how he, take this book and just read Mark and read what Matthew does all the way through, side by side. I don't think he likes Mark.
Right.
Martin
Right.
Smith called it parties and politics of late Second Temple Judaism. It spills on into the first century, beyond the first century, meaning up to the turn. Centuries don't matter, and that's our chronology, but the idea. Now, there's 70 years after Jesus' death, by what we call 100 CE. There are 5, 6, 7, 8 streams. I would call them spitting cousins, but to think that they're all the same. Now, in the so-called apostolic fathers, you begin to get some attempt to bring down some rule, like just follow the bishop. And, so we've got Ignatius and some of the letters of, the Polycarp and so forth. But
Thank you, Neil, for that super chat. Constellation Pegasus, Mr. Tabor, with all your researching, what is your conclusion on who Jesus really was?
this Jesus too. I guess I'll just play with you and say what Jesus. We did Matthew, Mark. We didn't do John. We did a little bit of Luke. I kind of go with the bare narrative. Like if you look at E.P. Sanders, Paula Fredrickson, Bart Ehrman, certainly Dale Allison, we get this kind of core that I would pretty well go with. Galilean peasant who I would say of Davidic line, but I know a lot of them don't go with that. But I would say of Davidic lineage because Paul is our earliest source, and he says I don't think he would have said he's from the seed of David if he wasn't, because that would be so.
Or at least he was claiming to be, at least,
certainly
right?
claiming, yeah.
Right.
So we can't investigate anybody's DNA back then, other than ossuaries, which is another subject. But anyway, so I would say there's that bare bio thing, what he said and what he did. I think what the Jesus Seminar comes up with on what he did, like Robert Funk and people like that, James Strange, there's a whole cluster of scholars that have worked with the archaeology, the texts, and so forth, became a disciple of John the Baptist, joined the movement, was opposed by Herod Antipas, gathered collections of disciples. I would even bring the rabbinic material in here for that. Finally went to Jerusalem, confronted the authorities in the temple, was crucified, was believed by his followers to have ascended to heaven and seated at the right hand of God in glory, apotheosis, like Romulus or like Apollonius of Tyana or other Greek heroes that are divinized. That's about it in terms of who he was. I probably would come up with more teachings that I'm pretty solid about than a lot of my colleagues. When people say, well, we don't have a clue as to what Jesus ever said, I think there's a kind of a body of material that comes through in the 2 sayings source. That's mostly teachings, the 60 sayings. There's a kind of thematic unity to it. In terms of, it'd be things like God looks at the inside, not the outside. Sounds a lot like Hillel, don't judge somebody by their race or their gender, but look at them in terms of their heart or their inner self, accepting Gentiles, open to women. You could make a whole list of things just by reading some of the teaching material in the so-called Q source. I would, I could rest with that that as an individual he put forth those things. I don't think it's particularly new though. When I read Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, particularly those, let me see who else, Micah. What does God really want? He doesn't want sacrifice. He wants the heart. He wants the devotion. He wants justice and righteousness. Cleanse the inside, not the outside, on and on and on. Don't be a hypocrite. Don't pray to be seen of men. Don't give to be seen of men. On and on and on. There's this body of material. It's really just good spiritual Judaism. You could call it, good spiritual Second Temple Judaism. You get a lot of that in Pirkei Avot, which is one of the tractates of the Mishnah, where you have the ethical teachings of the fathers. If you've never read that, you should read it. You'll be surprised. You'll think, this sounds a lot like Jesus, because he's coming from that milieu, from that culture. So I guess that's all I could say about who he really was. I certainly think he was a human being. Sometimes my students really press me on, they want to know theologically, like, what do you think about Jesus? So I finally came up with this thing. I hate to pass it on because it's kind of stark, but I think he's dead and he's not divine. Now, to lots of people, that would be like, that's Dr. Tabor has no faith. What if, let's see, I'm going to be dead. You're going to be dead.
Yeah.
He was a human being. He died. I'm not divine. You're not divine. He was a human being.
That's about as bad as saying to a Catholic, Joseph had sex with Mary. Are you kidding me? No, you didn't. It's
but that's in Matthew, right? He knew her not until she brought forth her son. So what does that mean?
Yeah.
He didn't know her. Like what was your name again? I think we know what that means.
We know.
So I don't know. Constellation Pegasus. I've seen you before. Appreciate the question.
Mm-hmm.
I think he needs to be seen as Gaze of Hermes is really good. Jesus the Jew. He compares him to Honi the circle drawer and other charismatic Galilean miracle workers of the time.
I got a couple goodies right behind me, and Gaze of Hermes. That book is back here too. It's somewhere in this region, but anyway, I won't waste.
When that book came out, believe it or not, people were like, "The Jew." I mean, it's like they were shocked at the title. I'd be like, what are you trying to sell books? You calling him a Jew?
I mean,
what was he, a Muslim?
Ask a Muslim. Yes, they will say it.
He was submissive to God, I guess, in his own.
That's what. Yeah, but I'm telling you.
But I should add, and we always have to add this. We have to add. He was uncompromisingly apocalyptic, right. And there I will go to the stake with Schweitzer.
Do you know what I was going to say? Dom, I like how Dom's open-minded to it, but like he said yesterday that and I don't want to get caught up in it. You know what I'm talking about. We should do a discussion later on at some point where
I think the reason I can appreciate, I think I don't want to say he's moving more towards the apocalypticism, but Dom, as he ages and thinks and meditates, I encourage everybody to listen to that 2-hour thing yesterday. It's so profound. You really see that his theism is a process theism. He doesn't call it that, but it's, quote, evolution.
Right.
But what he means by evolution is what I mean by Whiteheadian and, what we call process theism. It's not the God outside, but it's the process that we found ourselves part of has transcendent dimensions. So I think he's more open to the idea of the metaphor,
Right.
so that even though, no, the end didn't come, but let's don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because maybe we're bringing our own end right now. So yeah, it didn't come in 70 like it sounds like it should have in Mark 13. And immediately in those days after that time, and then you got your full preterists and so forth, claiming, yeah, but it did happen. He came in the clouds of heaven and the dead were raised. And I guess even the people were transformed, like 1 Corinthians 15, which I just can't go with.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's important to add as well. So yeah, ethical teacher, Mediterranean peasant. There's some stoicism that comes in there, but also he thinks the end of the age is near. Now, where he's different, I think, is he also seems to have this idea, and this is what Daum really picks up on, is the kingdom of God is here and now, as well as something out there that you're waiting for. So that already not yet thing.
I wonder if, and I'm not going to say, maybe Paul picked that up from sayings or teachings of Jesus, or maybe the gospel authors are putting Pauline ideas of already but not yet. I don't know. It's hard for me to put my head on this, but Pat Lowinger, thank you for the super chat. Another unapologetic subject matter expert. Thumbs up.
Thank you. I feel like I know very little. I was just now forgetting, was 2 Men in the Tomb or whatever. You mentioned Robin. I love when she'll say, like, well, I haven't looked at it. I haven't looked at that in 5 years. I can't really remember the details about the Gospels. Thank you. Because, I study them so much, but actually for the last 15 years, I've worked more on Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got a good knowledge of the Gospels because I teach it all the time, but it's, I need to refresh myself.
Apollo's Christian Apologetics. Is there ancient precedence for textual oral material being shared, revised in many close sources, like with the Gospels, or the Gospels a unique genre?
Oh, look at Talbert. What is a gospel? It's a book, and also articles. Charles Talbert. What is a gospel? He goes into all that. Gospels, erotologies, and romance literature always seem to overlap a little bit. An erotology is a panegyric that you would write about a hero. We have any number of them in the ancient world. That's always a question: is a gospel something different? Biography. Also, Morton Smith and Moses Hadas. I forgot the title. You could put it up on Amazon real quick. It's very, very good because he includes texts, the actual texts.
Who is this?
Morton Smith, and Moses Hadas. The title slips me, but it's something about biographies of divine men or something. But he actually puts those biographies. I took a course, Apollos, at the University of Chicago with Karsten Kolpe, and we did the Alexander romances. And there are three lives of Alexander, Pseudo-Callisthenes and so forth. They're not as close as these, like one wrote and then the other 10 years later and the other 10 years later. But they definitely have some overlaps and you can compare them. So we did a sort of synoptic study of the three surviving lives of Alexander the Great. And we tried to get at those same kind of elements. But I think what you can say is that each writer wants to give the pitch for his or her version of how the figures should be remembered. The one who doesn't do that very much would be the compiler, like, let's throw everything in, even the kitchen sink, would be Diogenes, Lives of the Philosophers. So you could look that up. It's in the Loeb Classics. And that's a trip because it'll go, let's say you're doing Plato. But they're great to read because you're reading all these biographies of the philosophers. I'm glad I thought of that. You guys, if you're interested in this, get Diogenes. This is Diogenes Laertius, not Diogenes of Sinope. He writes a life of Diogenes of Sinope, who's the philosopher. Remember the guy who tells Alexander, and he goes, "What can I do for you, the great Diogenes?" Stand out of my light, I'm reading. You want to hear more Diogenes of Sinope stories? He's masturbating in the street one day.
Yep.
And somebody says, "That is so disgusting. Why would you do that?" He said, "Well, I'm really starving and I wish I could rub my belly and get as much satisfaction."
Oh.
I mean, stuff like this. It's a little vulgar, but hey, we're
Yeah.
in the 21st century. And then the famous one is when he pees on a guy because they're calling him a cynic. And kunos means dog. And he goes, "I'm a cynic? Oh, then I need to lift my leg and pee on you then." Like a dog. So, but Diogenes Laertius, it's 2 volumes in the Loeb. Lives of the Philosophers. Go read those. And then read Lucian of Samosata, because he's the one writer that will make you laugh so hard out loud from antiquity that your family members will yell, "What is going on in that room? What are you doing?" Because you'll just be like, literally like, "I can't just this is so funny." So Alexander the false prophet, remember Alexander the false prophet, who creates a religion and fools everybody and so forth. So you got to read all this stuff. But what Diogenes Laertius does is he tells you everything anybody ever said. So he's doing Plato. He'll go, "Well, the Thracians say that Plato was born here, and the so-and-so says this, and then there's a legend of this, and the Dacians say that," it's like, it would almost be, I hate to pick on poor Kermit Sarley again, but put them all together and everything we know. But you know what? That's a lot of times what Christians do, is in their mind, like Christmas play, quiz. Ready? Apollos, you'll know this. Wise men come from the east, Matthew or Luke? Quick. You'll know it, Derek.
Yeah.
Shepherds in the fields at night, Matthew or Luke? Because I'm watching a Christmas play and they got both of those things. Herod kills the innocents, Matthew or Luke, and so forth. In our minds, we put them all together. Empty tomb, same thing. Well, didn't an angel come down and pull the rock back? You know how comments are, Derek, on YouTube. Oh my God, it's such a trip. Because people will say, I'll be talking about the ending of the Gospels and so forth, and they'll go, "Yeah, but it says they sealed it with a rock." I said, "It says? What's it? Is there a thing called it?" Matthew says that. And, in other words, you got to read Matthew is Matthew, Mark is Mark, Luke is Luke, John is John, and then try to understand what is the sum total of our evidence and make some kind of careful, notice I said careful judgments, not critical. I like the word critical, but people always think that means picking things apart, as I said earlier. So,
Thank you, Apollos. Humanist Reformation in Matthew 24:14, the Greek word oikumene is used that seems to have meant Roman world, opposed to world like we understand today. The same term is used in Luke 2:1. Does it really mean Roman world? Now, I could pull up, if you want me to, I could share the screen and
that's okay.
Pull up the verse. You know what it is, but I'll pull it up for our audience.
Because the Roman world is in some ways sort of the world, like preaching to the whole world, to all nations. They're not thinking of South and North America, Asia, Africa, and so forth, even though some of these places were known from spice trading and so forth in the East. But I think they were almost thought of as part of the ancient Near East, as we would say today. I don't think there's a consistency. We have good Greek lexicons. I would recommend you look it up in Arndt and Gingrich, which would be all the Koine Greek words, and see what the other references are. I haven't looked at that lately. But is that the passage in Luke about all the world was being taxed or something
Yes.
like that. Yeah.
Yep.
I think it could look, oikos means house. Okay. Dwelling. So it's almost like saying the dwellers, all the dwellers among the nations. So, but I think it would depend totally on the context. But the idea that there was a universal tax around the time Jesus was born in every province of Rome, that certainly doesn't seem to be the meaning. So,
Another problem, just to point out in that context there, and what makes it possibly a little bigger than universal or more universal, is that this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world. You could take that as just the Roman Empire, as a testimony to all nations. Now, one
right.
could say that this is only in the Roman Empire, but maybe they have that in mind.
Yeah, and they knew, Claudius had gone during Paul's day, he had gone up to the UK or Great Britain. Hadrian later has his wall even further up. So they're aware there's a tin industry from England that's thriving during the Roman period. The Rhine River is kind of a border for Gaul and for the German tribes, but they know they're up there. They know about Scandinavians being further north. But it's almost like we would say the Western world, the civilized world, they thought of themselves as being like, oh, we're the real world. And then the barbarians that, whose language is like, blah, 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 blah. Those people are over there. But
Right. Yeah. So it's hard to
good
say
question, though.
exactly.
But,
Yeah. I think this gets into the full preterist issue, where it's
oh, okay.
illogical. And I'm not saying humanist reformation has taken that claim. I think he follows our conclusions of failed prophecy, but nonetheless, full preterists will argue, it didn't fail because it's the Roman world, and or they'll try to, some of the full preterists use those arguments. Anyway, Cheryl, good to see you here.
Let me ask you, because you
Yeah.
did hold that view once. Is
Yeah.
there any evidence that it reached the North African provinces by 70?
There's no evidence for
Not
that.
Alexandria in Egypt, but for
No, I
all,
don't.
because that would definitely be part of the Roman world. And I don't know that we have any record of anybody preaching.
Yeah, we didn't even look at that evidence. What we would do is go look at Paul. And Paul says the gospel had been preached to all creatures or every creature. And we'd look at it in the way it was in English. None of us were speaking or reading in
Yeah,
Greek.
exactly.
Paul said something about that all the nations, the gospel has been preached to all the nations, or something like that. And
Yeah.
but he's still what got me, and why now that I look back, I'm like,
But
hold
he's
on.
still going to Spain. He thinks he has
Right.
to
What
keep
if
it
it already
going.
has been? Why is he
Mhm.
still on a journey? You would think he's
Mhm.
retiring now. All right, it's done. The mission's done, and Jesus is coming back right now, and therefore I don't have anything else to do.
Well, they knew people were north of the Rhine River, and they knew people were west of the Nile and
Mhm.
south of the Nile, and so those are people
Right.
that still need to be saved, supposedly. And they know there's things past Parthia. They know about India because the trade comes from India.
Yeah. There's just. Well, thank
Yeah.
you, Cheryl, for the super chat. How different is Jesus in his birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension than other gods in ancient history, Romulus or Hercules?
Yeah, well, pretty different and pretty similar. So I'll not answer your question, I guess. The thing is, we don't have, like Romulus, we have that famous account that Ovid gives it, right? Isn't it an Ovid, I think, about him ascending up and so forth?
Yes.
But we don't have a bio of him, and he's such a legendary character. I think with Jesus and Hercules also being, uh, he's so much a part of Greek and Mediterranean legend, whereas these gospels are written within decades of this figure living. So I think there's much more detail, walking around, going to this city, that city, sailing on the Sea of Galilee. So the differences might be simply the kind of records that we have. Uh, but I would even pick more historical characters than Romulus and Hercules.
Hmm.
more. Apollonius of Tyana, everybody should read that if they haven't, just as a bio that will remind you so much of Luke. And I would also recommend not Apollonius of Tyana, but Apuleius' Golden Ass or Metamorphoses, about Lucian and his adventures with Isis religion, because he's a convert to Isis, but down in Egypt. But that gives you a good handle on Hellenistic religiosity. So I would say it could just be the records, but also it's set in a Second Temple Jewish context. Like we know about Herod's temple, we know about what the architecture was and so much about it, that we naturally have more context. And then we have Paul's letters and so forth. So it's a matter of records, really, and proximity.
Can I play a little teaser that I put together for this whole Apollonius thing?
Sure. If people don't mind going more than 2 hours, which we've done.
People are hanging out. All right.
How many people are watching? 2?
Almost 300.
Oh, come on.
Okay, I'm dead serious. Okay.
Before he was born, it was known that he would be someone special. A supernatural being informed his mother that the child she was to conceive would not be a mere mortal, but would be divine. He was born miraculously, and he would become an unusually precocious young man. As an adult, he left home and went on an itinerant preaching ministry, urging his listeners to live, not for the material things of this world, but for what is spiritual. He gathered a number of disciples around him who became convinced that his teachings were divinely inspired, in no small part because he himself was divine. He proved it to them by doing many miracles, healing the sick, casting out demons, and raising the dead. But at the end of his life, he aroused opposition, and his enemies delivered him over to the Roman authorities for judgment. Still, after he left this world, he returned to meet his followers in order to convince them that he was not really dead, but he lived on a heavenly realm. Later, some of his followers wrote books about him. Everyone meet Apollonius of Tyana.
Even before that one always gets me, because Bart Ehrman actually wrote the statement there, and I just took that and just was, I'm making a little short clip with Bart Ehrman's, thing about Apollonius of Tyana, and I just thought that was interesting. So
yeah.
Okay, Rhett Jet, Dr. Tabor, do we know the authors of the Gospels? Was it really Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? Did the authors know Jesus?
I think there's general agreement, and I would share this view, that we do not know who the authors were. They're anonymous. Even Luke, who uses I, but he doesn't give his name. He does say he's not an eyewitness. These are traditional designations. They began to get used in the 2nd and 3rd century, and then as the canon is put together. Did they know Jesus? You don't get the idea from, let's take Mark, the earliest. He would be the one to start with. There's never any place where the author does address the reader once about a passage in the Apocalypse, Mark 13, where he's referring to Daniel, and he doesn't tell you what book. He just says, let the reader understand. So even then you got to figure it out. But he never says, and I saw this, and I was there, and I testify that this is true, as you do in the Gospel of John. Now in John, remember, toward the end, you do get this thing about, we know that the witness of this one is true. So even there, they're saying, we it's not our witness, but we know that this person who's passed this on is true, but we don't know who that person is. The idea that John, son of Zebedee, wrote John, I think just doesn't make any sense at all. And further, the idea that he's the beloved disciple, I've written a lot about that, and it's either Lazarus or James or Mary Magdalene, maybe, if you want to go with a woman. And if it's Lazarus, Mary Magdalene is probably the same as Mary of Bethany. So, maybe it's a composite idea of some, the intimates of Jesus, the people who are really close to him. But I think it's James because he turns his mother over to his care. And that's what a Jewish boy would do, eldest boy, when he dies, pass on the mother to the next in line, which is James. And also James is in charge of the community and lives in Jerusalem. And so the idea that Mary would not be in his care makes no sense at all. So what's the proof of that? Paul goes up to visit James, and all of our traditions, Stephen Schumacher's done the most on the Mary traditions. He shows that very strong, this idea that Mary went with John to Asia Minor and lived at Ephesus and that sort of thing. That's another John, apparently, but it's going too far afield for tonight. So,
thank you,
anyway,
Rhett.
yeah.
Constellation Pegasus, and we'll blast through these, Dr. Tabor, because it's getting late where you're at, and your apotheosis is supposed to happen sometime in the
I
next.
just want a glass of wine or something. So
do you want to go for it?
I can go get one. I think that's allowed on YouTube. But
Would you? I don't think it's a problem, but if you want to grab,
yeah, I see Constellation's question. Great donation.
Yeah,
I think you mean the RSV, not the ESV. But yes, absolutely. I talk about that in my translation of Genesis. I did a blog post for Bart Ehrman's blog, if you remember there. And also on my blog, jamestabor.com. It's called Lost in Translation. And I give the story of the burning of the RSV. Here it is. It's the translation I normally use. So yeah, they were just so upset at two things. Not putting virgin for young woman in Matthew's birth story. They are rather putting young woman for virgin. I'm sorry, I misspoke. A young woman will conceive because it doesn't have the word virgin in Greek. And then also, in Greek it does, but not in the quotation from Isaiah. And then Mark 16. In the new version, because they want to sell RSVs still, they mark it off with a space, and then they have the longer of the fake versions, but they put a little note saying this, many authorities think this is later. So it's still there because it's the favorite of evangelicals. Go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature, baptize, pick up snakes, drink poison, speak in tongues. I mean, if you take away that, what happens to the charismatic movement in the Appalachians, So, but it's look at my blog because greatly title post the original ending of Mark and why it makes all the difference. So it's defending the idea that please let Mark end the way he wants. Imagine if you were a filmmaker, say you're Bergman or any great filmmaker that's really classic, and you've made your film and then somebody comes along and says, yeah, but I'm going to use that, but I'm going to put a different ending. You can't do that. You can't put a different ending. In the Mark 16 ending, the fake, there are three, actually four if you count them all. I think Bart said there were four, but there are three that are in the RSV. One of them is so fake that you would laugh if I read it. You want me to read it? No. Well, go read it. Yeah. It's like, and they preached the everlasting gospel in every nation, and everybody believed, and glory, hallelujah, and it's all wonderful. I mean, it's just like somebody just wrote some kind of theological thing. But the one that everybody has in the King James, it's in most manuscripts, but it's later. It's a composite of Matthew, Luke, and John. Read it. Literally, it's like a little bit of Matthew, a little bit of Luke, a little bit of John. They're even in order. So somebody just thought, he needs a better ending. I don't want to make it up. But since Matthew had a good ending, Luke had a good ending about the men from Emmaus and so forth. And John has a real good ending about the Sea of Galilee, I'll just put those in. And that's what he does. And he's got the Great Commission, of course. Preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, and so forth. So,
right. Thank you, Constellation. William Martin says the violent imagery in Luke that predicts that family members will turn against one another because of theological and sectarian differences relating to Jesus Christ sadly seems a prophecy fulfilled.
yeah, that's true.
Thank you, William.
Throughout the history of religion, unfortunately, right?
Yeah.
Families, nations, kingdoms. Boy, it's so bad what people have done to one another.
That's true. Native, forgive me if I butcher your name. What's the relationship between Genesis?
Maybe.
Nadav?
Yeah.
Between Genesis 2 through 4 and the theologies Paul's in the New Testament, Hellenistic or Persian influence, Philo of Alexandria? I'm confused.
I think the main way Paul gets into Genesis 2 through 4 actually, yeah, that would be this Garden of Eden stuff. That would be with his second Adam thing, I think. I see that as more coming out of Second Temple Judaism somehow. But I think Persian influence, Hellenistic influence, and then Philo maybe not as separate, but also influenced by those. It's just it's kind of a swimming pool of mixtures of culture during the Roman period. So Paul is very Hellenized, so is Jesus, so is every form of Judaism that I know of. If you define Hellenism as a sort of dualism that's mainly concerned with the world to come, eternal life, religions that are looking to the heavenly world, the expanded cosmos, doing something beyond death in the expanded cosmos, as opposed to Gilgamesh, as opposed to the Hebrew Bible, where you die and go to Sheol. You're a human being. It's not your place. You don't belong in heaven. You might visit there and you're going to get knocked back down. You can't stay. That's the big shift. And that's what makes the Hebrew Bible kind of unique, in that it's everybody's not reading Gilgamesh anymore and all of the ancient Near Eastern texts and even the Egyptian texts of the earlier period. It's a life in the tomb. If there's any life at all, it's in the tomb. And it's a shadowy, look at Plato's Republic, Book 10, where Odysseus goes down to the underworld. Look at Gilgamesh. I cover all of that in the book you held up, Derek, if you have it handy, Paul's Ascent to Paradise. The second chapter is about the Hellenistic influence on Paul's theology. So I wouldn't say it's Genesis directly, but Genesis has to be used and reinterpreted as it is with Philo. It has to be, because otherwise, how could you have the foundational book of beginnings not reflect the whole purpose of the cosmos? Well, it doesn't. Dust you are, to dust you will return. However, there is the tree of life. However, remember Gilgamesh. He gets the plant, right? He gets the plant that will give you eternal life, and a snake eats it. And then what?
Yep.
He dies. So yes, they could dream of a lost tree that could have given them eternal life. But that's a story basically saying, as Bob Dylan would put it, it ain't you, babe. You're not a god. You're a human. Remember the Nakash, I call him, not Satan, not even a snake, the gleaming one, the Nakash. He says, you will be as gods. But he doesn't say having eternal life. But Yahweh then says, we got to get them out of here. It's kind of like a heavenly dwelling, right? Got to get them out of this garden. because they could go eat the tree and live forever. It's very, very parallel to the idea of the Gilgamesh. Like Gilgamesh is going to get the secret from Napash's team and his wife, who are on this island of the blessed, and they're living forever. But that's the exception. But he's going to get it, and he doesn't. He loses it. So Genesis is basically a story of how humans don't get it. And I would say all the way through the Hebrew Bible, I know you can find some verses where you say, if I make my bed in Sheol, you are there, or something like that. Well, God in the Hebrew Bible, in some texts, fills heaven and earth, but you can't show me a text where people come out of Sheol, except Daniel 12, maybe Isaiah 24, 26. Remember that little Isaiah apocalypse? That seems to be just stuck in Isaiah because it's got all that cosmic stuff about, thy dead will live, my dead body will rise, who's my? It's very confusing in Hebrew and in the Septuagint. There's no eternal life in the Hebrew Bible, basically, but it's coming in fast in the Hellenistic period.
Yeah. And thanks to Persian probably influence as well. But
Persian, heavy influence.
Inquisitive mind, did Arabs visit the Jewish temple before 70 AD?
Well, certainly people from Arabia can go to the temple, if that's what you mean. I'm not sure.
I guess the question is, did they? I mean, they can, but did they go to the temple? Were there Muslims, I guess you'd say, if you want to be a
Muslims?
That's the problem, is like, I think this is going to get into the topic of...
Well, it depends on what you mean by Muslim. If you mean the religion as solidified or codified by the Prophet Muhammad, then obviously not, later. Unless they're time travelers, like an Outlander or something. But remember, Herod married the daughter of an Arab, and he himself, his mother is Arab. So it really depends on what's behind the question. So
yeah, and
but
I don't
all Gentiles can go to the temple. They can't. The court of the Gentiles is huge. Many football fields. If you've been up there, I'll take you there, Eric. Your eyes are going to pop out when you really see how big it is. I mean, it is vast.
Can I walk past into the court of the Jews and not be killed today?
Absolutely. But you can't go in the Dome of the Rock anymore. Right. And that's actually, Dome said last night in 67, before then he used to go. I went in the Dome of the Rock in the 90s when I took my students. We used to sit in there for hours. This stopped fairly recently.
Thank you for the question, Ghost of Myth Vision. I'm not sure exactly where you're going with it, but I suspected.
Let me tell you this too, that Jews in the 1800s had placemats in their homes in the Jewish quarter with the Dome of the Rock on the placemat, because they saw it as a protection for the stone of Abraham, Moriah. They didn't see it. It's not a mosque. People think it's a mosque. It's not a mosque. It's a shrine or a covering to protect the rock. That's why it's called Dome of the Rock. You follow? Mm-hmm. So it didn't have that political connotation until more modern times, with the conflicts post
wow.
40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Constellation Pegasus, again, thank you for that wonderful super chat. Why didn't the gospel writers demand their names be recognized as the authors? How did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John get in them?
But often works do not have the name ancient works within the work itself. So if you're writing in the first person and you're going to tell a lot of things that you did, like say Mark said, oh, and also I remember going into the house with him and we had some fish after he healed the paralytic, and I'll never forget it. It was tasting really good. And you get that kind of thing in Josephus all the time, also in antiquities. So let's try to think of a work that is giving a narrative of a famous figure, and we know who wrote it, maybe, but the name is not inside the book.
Rhett Jet says, with the flood myths and so many civilizations, does this imply one ancient flood or localized flood stories around civilizations next to bodies of water?
The way to get out of that is I have no expertise in anything before the Maccabean period. No, no, before Alexander the Great. I really haven't traced flood legends much. I mean, everybody knows about the ancient Near Eastern ones, Enuma Elish and all of those, but I don't, I remember hearing when I was a kid growing up, because I got the same apologetics that a lot of you did, was Haley's Bible Handbook or something like that. And it would go like, there are over 230 flood legends. The Polynesians say a man in a boat, this and that. And I always wondered what the sources for those were, because missionaries had gone to those places and preached and left Bibles. And, but this was just like a list. And that would prove this and that. And it's the same thing you see about, have you ever seen this thing that circulates on the internet? There were 12 gods born of a virgin who were executed and rose from the dead on the third day before Jesus. And you go like, oh, really? Let's list them out. And you always have to say, what are the sources?
Right.
Like, did you know that Jesus as a kid used to go with Joseph of Arimathea, who was a tin merchant, and visit the British Isles? And Glastonbury has the traditions of, and you go like, when was that first told? And somebody goes, I think it was 1450, or something like that. And you go like, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Or Mary Magdalene is in France and she has a baby and she's married there and they fled in a boat. And when was that first told? I'm not making fun of Mary Magdalene legends, believe me, because I'm actually very interested in her. But I just always have to ask because I think she was a real founder, a really important figure who's been muted in early Christianity. But I'm talking about when you jump 500, 800, 1,000 years, and then start telling the legends of a culture in France or England. For me as a historian, I just have to say, well, that was the lore of the time, but I can't jump back to the Roman period with things like that. So
thank you, Rhett. And the last one, Constellation Pegasus. Was the word homosexual first put in the Bible in 1946?
You thinking of the RSV again?
I would imagine.
I don't know. The RSV. Let's look. It would be 1 Corinthians 6. There's descriptions of men with men in Romans 1, but you're talking about the word. Let's see.
Right, that specific word.
No, they're two words, and they translate both words together as sexual perverts. That's the RSV. I think this is, but whether this is the 46th edition, I don't know. I have a 46th edition, but I don't have it here at home. You can, I'm sure, Google that and find out.
Yeah. I want to ask you, James, and thank you for spending extra time here. Tell us, why does everyone need to go subscribe to your blog?
Well, you'll get updates of anything that's posted. The newsletter is monthly, and you can see there where you sign up for that. But the main thing would be the search feature up at the top, or you can go all the way up and do it, or it's actually the first thing. Search using keywords to the right there. Type in almost anything, and you're going to find 20 or 30 major entries that are not just little blog entries like what I did this morning or something like that, but they'd be like 15, 20 pages of all kinds of literature and discussions. I'm thinking of publishing an anthology of some of the best posts that would become a little book, just like you have chapters in a book that are on random topics. Because I spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours writing these blog posts. with a
Also, your books. I have all of the recommended books down in the recommended book list. You can go and get all of his copies of his works there. And you also are on Audible. A couple of the books you have are on Audible. Go check it
the
out. I know
Simon and Schuster books are Audible. The others, Why Waco may or may not. I don't think it is. That's about the Waco 1993. There's also a book called A Noble Death that's out of print. But if you want to start with my stuff, if you're new to me, I would start with the Jesus Dynasty. I mean,
Yeah,
that's my magnum opus on Jesus when I was 60 years old. And I'm 76 now. So I don't hold all the views the same. You know, people change. That's a good thing. But Paul and Jesus picks up with a lot of additional things. And then Jesus' discoveries about the Talpiot tomb. Paul's ascent to Jesus. Book of Genesis is just something I did over the years. I got so frustrated with poor translations and decided to give it a try based on the Hebrew Bible. So
I love Paul and Jesus. I love the Jesus Dynasty. I love Paul's Ascent. I mean, if you paperback or Audible, either way, the people who read it are really good. So if you're one of those who has to drive and listen, Audible, check out his books. And of course, get true salvation. Join MythVision's Patreon. In fact, I might as well let him know Dr. Tabor's also on the Patreon list. So you're one of my patrons, and I hope that people will come. Come join us. I mean,
we have some really provocative titles. The Day Judaism Was Born. We got that one.
That one's fun.
We got the crucified Maccabean king Antigonus and his DNA. We got a whole bunch of stuff coming out later. So
I know I got to edit those, and especially the one on the birth of Judaism as we know it. I'm gonna have
the oven of Acme. The oven of Acme. Judaism was born over an argument about an oven.
Yeah. And should it be one piece? Can it, there's all sorts of stuff that gets involved. It's really fun. Any final words from you? Any positive?
No, I just mainly, the world is my classroom. I really feel that now. And I miss my students, but after 43 years of teaching, without a break, I'm ready for the break and mostly for the freedom.